Hello and welcome once more to another episode of American Spaces on Air, a podcast brought to you by the American Space at Instituto Chileno Norteamericano in Santiago, the American Academy of Science and Technology at Universidad de Talca, and the Fulbright Commission in Chile, with the support of the United States Embassy in Santiago and the American Spaces Network in Chile. Today, we are joined by a very special guest. She is recognized as one of the 50 female leading scientists in the international field of fire science. She's a scholar of human behavior and environmental change. She's also a PhD in forest resources from Oregon State University, and she was awarded a Fulbright scholarship for research on wildfire as a social ecological system at Universidad Austral de Chile, here in Chile, Valdivia. So, hi, Paige. Her name is Paige Fischer. So, hi, Paige. Welcome to American Spaces on Air. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for being with us. So, Paige, my first question to you is going to be: why did you choose to come to Chile for your Fulbright scholarship? And are you still here with us?
Yeah, well, I chose Chile because so many of the issues there are really relevant to the things I do here in the United States. I've spent my career as a professor and a researcher trying to understand how people can learn to live with increasing wildfire risk in forested areas. And much of my work focuses on the Western United States, since the West is a region where we're experiencing a lot of wildfires, and it's also where I'm from. And Chile is really similar to the Western United States in many ways. And one of those ways is that it's experiencing more frequent and larger and more severe wildfires in forested areas. So I thought that spending time in Chile would give me insight not only into the problem of wildfire in the United States, the Western United States, but also into the global wildfire problem, because it really is a global problem. And then also, in addition, Chile has been on my mind since I first visited there in 1999 for a conference on forests. And that's when I got a glimpse of the incredible forests in Chile and the incredible natural landscape. And I always wanted to go back. So I finally got a chance with the Fulbright, and I was there. So I'm no longer there. I was there for 3.5 months. From March until June, and that's how long the Fulbright supported me there. So I'm back home now and getting ready for the school year to start at my own university.
Nice, very good. Okay, and what can you tell us about your role as a Fulbright alumni at Universidad Austral while you stayed here in Chile?
Yeah, well, my Fulbright was for both research and teaching. And so for the teaching part, I developed a graduate level seminar course on wildfire as a global social ecological system. And I co-taught that with my host in Chile, Dr. Mauro Gonzalez, who's a professor of forest sciences and natural resources at the Universidad Austral de Chile in Valdivia. I also gave a number of presentations about the wildfire crisis from the US, kind of the US experience, and compared it with the Chilean experience. And I gave these presentations to students and faculty at universities, and then also outside of academia in Chile. And then as for the research part, I spent much of my time investigating the wildfire situation in Chile, how it came to be such a big problem, why people are concerned about it, what are the impacts, and what can be done to reduce the risks going forward. And I did this by spending a lot of time reading articles and reports by Chilean experts, talking with Chilean experts. I spent a lot of time talking through the issue with Dr. Mauro Gonzalez and also Dr. Gonzalo Zavendra at who's also at Austral. He's a professor of anthropology. I also attended a conference on megafires in Chile, and I gave a presentation there and talked with a lot of the experts who were there. That was at Universidad de Concepción. And then really kind of the thing that I did in terms of research that really was had the greatest impact on me was I spent 3 weeks visiting with communities who had been affected by wildfires in La Araucanía, in Biobío, and in Valparaiso.
Very good. Yeah. And Yeah, I mean, Chile is a country that's been suffering from wildfires more and more with the passage of time. Last year, we even had some wildfires that were so intense that the smoke got to the capital here in Santiago, and we saw orange skies similar to those in New York City this year because of the same problem. But going back to the interview, in simple words, could you tell us about your research called "Understanding Wildfires as a Social Ecological System"? What is it about?
Right. Yeah, so this is what I've been spending much of my time doing in research lately, is really trying to understand the complexity of wildfire. So trying to understand something as a social ecological system means paying attention to both the social and the ecological drivers and impacts of the thing, and how these social and ecological drivers and impacts interact with each other, and sometimes unintentionally reinforce each other, making the problem worse. So in the case of wildfire, in the past, wildfires really have been treated or viewed like other natural hazards, like earthquakes or volcanic eruptions or hurricanes. A fire breaks out, we try to reduce the impacts by putting it out and repeat. But these days, we're really realizing in the United States, around the world, in Chile, that in many places, wildfires are really becoming an intractable problem. So one that's really defying our ability to manage it through wildfire or through firefighting alone. And this is because in places like the United States, the US West, and in Chile, wildfires are human-caused natural hazards. And through our behavior, we're making fires worse on a lot of different levels. And sometimes our very efforts to reduce the risk of wildfire actually increase the risk, make it worse. So understanding something as a social ecological system is really stepping back and taking a systems level look at it, a holistic look at it, where we're looking at all the drivers, both social, ecological, and all the impacts and the interactions between them. So I can give a couple examples of that.
Yes, please do.
So like at one level, kind of more the local level, people ignite wildfires as part of our routine kind of habitation patterns. We ignite fires accidentally by burning garbage in our backyards, by lighting campfires, by using mechanized equipment. And sometimes, of course, people light fires intentionally through arson. This is true in both Chile and the United States and elsewhere. It kind of comes with being human, igniting wildfires. But as our populations grow and we do more things that intentionally or unintentionally light fires, and as our communities expand, because we're growing, expanding into forested areas, the more these fires are becoming wildfires or forest fires. And importantly, like in the case of Chile, the more we expand forests or plantations into communities, the more hazard we create for people. And then the more we respond to this issue just with firefighting without really addressing the root cause of the problem, the more these wildfires are really becoming disasters. So, there's a lot of causes of the problem, and it's really complicated. And that's just at the local level. Then at the global level, we have climate change, which is exacerbating fire risk, because of carbon emissions. So, it's causing droughts, heat events that dry out vegetation, and these prime forests to burn. Like I've heard that there's, been kind of unprecedented heat in Chile this winter, and that's drying out vegetation. We've been experiencing that in the United States as well. So, again, as communities expand into forest areas, and the more we expand forests or plantations to communities with these really flammable conditions caused by this kind of global problem of climate change, at the local level, we're having, greater risks. So that's kind of an example of, you've got ecological influences, you've got human influences, you got stuff going on at the global level and the local level, and it's all kind of interacting to make the problem worse.
Very good. And going back to that local level, um, how do cultural factors play a role in these challenges?
Yeah, well, that's a really important question, and that's where being able to work with people like Dr. Saavedra, who's an anthropologist, and Mauro Gonzalez, who's an ecologist, really help kind of tease out these different factors. And some of the cultural ones are really important. So I can kind of give an example from the United States and then an example from Chile about how these cultural factors play a role. So like in the United States, Euro-American settlers who moved out into the western part of the country really saw fire as a negative force to be controlled, in part because they weren't really from areas where fire played an important ecological disturbance role, as fires do in the western US because of lightning. And so this predisposed society in the West, dominated by colonial Euro-Americans, towards fire suppression as kind of our go-to response. But in the West and in many places, not all cultures look at it this way. So there are a lot of Native American tribes in the US West and elsewhere who have long used fire as a cultural and an ecological stewardship tool. And evidence is building that these native stewardship practices kept large wildfires in check and really help shape our forests. And from kind of the situation in Chile, our cultural influences are reflected in plantations. There's a lot of different influences on Chile's shift into an export-oriented plantation forestry sector, not the least of which is the United States policy and relations with Chile. But the history of colonialism by Europeans, especially Germans, who have focused a lot on scientific forestry and agricultural style silvicultural practices, has likely predisposed Chile for developing a plantation forestry economy. So there's a lot of really important cultural factors to look at especially when we're trying to step back and look at wildfire as holistically as a system.
Very good. So wildfires have become more frequent and intense in recent years around the globe. How can we better understand the human dimension of wildfire risk and response?
Well, I think that taking the approach that I'm describing here, looking at it as a social ecological system and identifying all the human drivers and the impacts and the ecological drivers and the impacts and how they can interact and kind of reinforce each other, both intentionally and unintentionally. I think it really, gives us a tool to be able to look out into the future and think about the unintentional consequences of our present day decisions. This kind of helps us do thought exercises to think, if we make these decisions now, what might we have in the future? And I think that, in Chile, we can kind of see, looking at it historically, but also looking out to the future, we can see how the drive to become a competitive global economic force through the development of an export-oriented forestry sector and the expansion of plantations of exotic species, some of which are flammable, like radiata pine and eucalyptus, it's created, a real intractable kind of fire problem now. And we're looking out to the future and thinking about, well, what's going to happen with climate change? Like how are heat conditions going to change? How is precipitation going to change? Going through this process of thinking about population growth and our behavior in combination with some of those influences, thinking about that into the future can really help us, think through different alternative ways of managing our, populations, our communities, and our forests.
Perfect. And okay, so we've been talking about what the drivers are and all of the things that can lead to forest fires. So would you like to share some of your findings from your research?
Yeah, and so definitely my research is ongoing. My time in Chile was exploratory. I was really trying to learn about the situation in Chile with the hope that I would continue at least having conversations with colleagues there, if not potentially cooperating or taking on new research into the future. So, significant findings are in the works. But there are definitely some things that I found that are definitely significant to me. And one is kind of just the issue of, kind of the irony of the issue with plantations and communities and how we're managing them differently. How in Chile they're being managed kind of differently. So, at the same time that there's a lot of energy going into preventing fires on plantations and developing silvicultural practices for plantations that will prevent fires from spreading. There's also efforts going on to encourage communities to protect themselves from fire by reducing vegetation around their homes and becoming more prepared to fight fires for themselves or evacuate if they need to. But one thing that I realized I think is very common where you have these kinds of complex problems that really span a lot of different scales or levels, it's hard to kind of have a dialogue between the different efforts. So I think that's one thing I learned in Chile is how hard it is to have a national dialogue about kind of the fundamental root causes of the problem. When you're really trying to react on so many different levels. And I think in Chile, as in the United States, there's only so much that communities can do to protect themselves from wildfire when they are surrounded by really flammable conditions. In Chile, it's timber plantations. In the United States, it's lots of public land that's very flammable. And so one of the things that really struck me was when I was there is really the need to have more kind of coordination across national and regional and local levels around these kinds of policies that really aim to do the same thing, which is reduce risk.
Very good. Now, in August, we are celebrating the International Peace Month, a time to reflect on the First World War. But if we think about ourselves as living beings and the ecological system as a whole, how can living in safe and healthy environments contribute to peaceful societies?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important question. And so the way I kind of, when I think about that question, I think about how there's more and more evidence coming out that links climate, or adverse climate conditions with social conflict. And there's more evidence and kind of more news coverage that suggests that, changes in temperature, precipitation, really when it's getting hotter and drier, that can lead to increased conflict and violence. Because it exacerbates the root causes of social conflict and violence, which is really scarcity and unequal access to resources. And I think we can see this, starting, or we can imagine this happening in the case of fire, just because, it's the poor who arguably suffer most because they lack, the resources to build fire-resistant homes. This is what we're asking people in fire-prone areas to do. We're asking people to improve their communities, to protect their communities. Well, that's really hard because it requires resources that some poor communities don't have. It's harder for poorer people to move out of harm's way, to relocate, to migrate, and to rebuild. It's hard for people with fewer resources to rebuild and recover after losses. So, the time I spent visiting communities that had been burned by wildfires in Valparaiso and, Biobío and La Araucanía kind of provided some examples of that, and examples that can be found in many other countries where the people who have experienced or, experienced burning wildfires, have lost things to wildfires are often, the underhoused populations. And that was true, I think, in Valparaiso, at least what I saw. And then also like in Biobío and La Araucanía, it seems like a lot of the people who've really been affected are the rural agricultural communities and Mapuche communities. So, those are some examples of kind of how it's important to really think about how, climate can affect, poor people and people with fewer resources, and how that can really raise these questions about the root causes of social conflict, which is scarcity and unequal access to resources.
Absolutely. And you were talking a little bit about this on one of your previous answers, but in your experience, what sort of successful examples of traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous practices have been valuable in adapting to climate change and mitigating natural hazards?
Yeah, well, so I was referring to kind of what I knew about the US West, and I think those are some really good examples where Native American tribes in the United States have used fire for millennia and as a tool for managing, cultivating plants and animals and hunting. And more and more evidence is coming out that these more frequent, low intensity, and carefully timed fires have kept flammable fuels low. So Chile is very different because it has a very different, ecosystem, where one that isn't many forested areas in Chile are not fire adapted in the same way that they are in the United States, just because lightning is less prevalent. But one thing I did that struck me when I was visiting with communities about traditional ecological knowledge and how they could be, and indigenous practices and how they could be valuable, is that I was speaking with a community leader in La Araucanía who said that it was really unfortunate that his people didn't really, that it was difficult for his community to have a lot of influence on the plantations that were around them, because he said that they had a long history of really strong social relations and cooperation, and that really can promote collective action. And that could have been really helpful for facilitating community involvement in fuel reduction, where, different people who manage different parts of the landscape could coordinate their practices to reduce the connectivity of flammable fuels and prevent fire from moving from one part of the landscape to the other. Well, in the particular case in this community, the community was surrounded by a single plantation owner who I don't think lived locally. And so it was really difficult for them to communicate, much less cooperate on reducing wildfire risk. But they do have the practices as part of their community and their culture that could be leveraged if an opportunity was created. So that's an example of how indigenous practices really could be valuable in adapting to wildfire risk in climate change.
Perfect. And what are some other key aspects to take into consideration for communities adapting to the changing climate, both in psychological and social way?
Yeah, I mean, so much of my work focuses kind of more at the individual level about the cognitive or psychological or social psychological influences on people's decisions, on people's behavior, so how they perceive risk and act on those perceptions. So I think that's all really important because it really helps us understand how to design policy that targets individuals or households or communities, because it's really important to know whether people, just aren't concerned, or whether they just don't perceive the risk, or if it's a matter of not having the resources. That way we can figure out, well, how do we want to design policies, whether to incentivize or educate. But I also think it's really important to pay attention to kind of the broader structural constraints, like I saw in Chile and that I know exist in the United States, where if a community is surrounded by plantation forests or public forests, and they can't have any influence over the fire risk conditions, then that's really going to constrain and kind of depress their motivation to do things in their own community. So I think that just really kind of having a more coordinated effort of paying attention to or considering the psychosocial motivations as well as structural constraints on people's behavior can really help us think about kind of the options for climate change adaptation and what policy can do.
Perfect. I would also like to ask you, what steps can be taken to ensure equitable outcomes for affected populations and to address the concept of what they call climate justice?
Yeah, I think that, it's a challenge, and it's really complicated. And I think, so one thing is to really think about or have a better understanding of who is being affected, like who are the more vulnerable populations with regard to any given hazard, and how can we design our policy and programmatic responses to a hazard by really prioritizing those groups. So, in Chile, like I said, I spent some of my time visiting communities that had been hit hard by recent wildfires. And as it turned out, Bio and La Araucanía, I realized, are regions that have lower income levels compared to other regions in Chile. They are higher proportions of kind of rural population, higher proportions of original peoples population. And so, and there are also areas where plantation forestry has been expanding in recent years. So, paying attention to kind of the socio-demographics of the areas where the hazards really seem to be, getting worse, is a really important step, because that way we can think about how we can design policy and program to really, focus on those groups and try to, protect them or give them the resources so they can protect themselves first. So that's one way to think about how we can kind of address the concept of climate justice as we respond to these natural hazards.
Very good. Okay, I have one final question for you, Paige, and it's how do you think policymakers and urban planners can better integrate human dimensions research into their decision-making processes to create a more sustainable or resilient cities, especially considering countries like Chile that may have a higher exposure to different types of natural disasters like wildfires, tsunamis, earthquakes, etc.?
Yeah, well, I think that some of this is being done in Chile. Some of the colleagues I met there are thinking along these lines that I guess are my answer to your question. And that is really engaging communities in planning processes and deliberative policymaking. I definitely heard that there is a lot of attention to that in Chile. I mean, there's a lot of different, the nuclei research centers, the roundtables. There's a lot of effort being placed on doing that. And I think that that's really critical, because that's how one learns about the more vulnerable populations. That's how you learn about the kinds of levers that policy should be targeting, in terms of whether people need education or incentives. And so I think the idea of participatory policy making, and Chile is really been a really good example of that in recent years. Participatory policy making, civic engagement at all different levels is really critical for moving forward, because we're really, there's so much to learn about how people are being affected by climate change and by these natural hazards like wildfire risk. And so one of the best ways to figure out who's being affected and how is really by engaging with them and learning from them. So that's one kind of avenue.
Absolutely. And that engagement will eventually get people on the same page. So it's a great way of spreading the information and learning how to control a situation like a wildfire.
Right. It's not like, okay, the solution, but it's a step,
Yes.
right? It's a step it's an important step in developing policies and programs to address them, the hazards.
Absolutely. Perfect. Paige, we want to thank you for your time. Thank you for being a part of our interview series here at American Spaces on Air. And we hope to see you soon, here in Chile, continuing your research. So thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you so much. I look forward to a chance to come back to Chile and stay in touch with my colleagues there and continue working on these issues. Chile is a really fascinating country, and there's so many interesting and promising things going on there. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, and goodbye.